Today we've got something exciting for you. Today we're running a watermill.
Welcome to English Country Life. My name's Fiona, and together with my husband Hugh, we've come over to Cogglesford Watermill here in Sleaford in Lincolnshire in the UK. The mill here has started to run experience days, so this video is a little bit different to our normal videos, but it's fascinating. What we're going to be doing is actually milling our own flour. So we're going to show you the mechanism, how the watermills actually worked, and all of the machinery, because it's both noisy but also fascinating. We're also then going to be showing you how the wheat is taken into the millstones, how all of the different aspects work, and then finally we'll show you how the flour is separated using a lovely bit of machinery from the bran husks itself. So join us for this experience day.
Before we go through and show individual bits of machinery, just having some context is really useful, and I think this cutaway model really helps to understand how the mill works. On the right hand side is the water wheel, which is actually inside the building on this mill, and that water wheel operates a central shaft that goes through all three floors of the mill, and it operates different machinery at different levels. So at the top floor, that shaft drives a chain hoist, and that chain hoist can lift the wheat to the top of the building, where the miller will put the wheat into hoppers ready for milling. On the centre floor, there's an enormous wheel driven by that central shaft that can operate two different millstones for different types of flour, and it can operate them independently or together. And on the ground floor, where the flour goes down, there is another machine that can separate for white flour the bran from the flour itself. So the whole machines are driven by a single central shaft, and the product becomes increasingly refined as it works its way down the building. Now this mill is gravity fed, so what we have to do is get the wheat as the first process up to the top so gravity can bring it down through the wheels. We're going to do that now, and we're going to explain the equipment as we go along. There are many types of water wheel. The best and most efficient kind is the kind called the overshot wheel, where the water cascades over the top of the wheel, runs down the other side, and it uses gravity to aid driving the wheel, but you need a big fall of water for that. The least effective is the undershot wheel, where effectively a stream runs underneath the wheel, turning the paddles. What we have here is a breastshot wheel, where the water runs underneath but has a bigger fall than an undershot wheel. In order to make it work, what we have to do is open the sluice, and the wheel is inside the building here, which I found quite unusual. But opening the sluice, which really isn't as hard as you might think, starts to turn that 3-ton wheel, or at least it's 3 tons when it's dry, it's 3.5 tons when it's wet. And as soon as that wheel turns, the big wheel on the right turns, because it's connected by an axle to the water wheel, and that's called the pit wheel. And that in turn is turning the wallower, the central one, which is attached to the vertical shaft that rises through the building. And that central shaft turns all the other machinery. What we're looking at here is the enormous 10-foot wide spur wheel, which is on the stone floor, the middle floor of the building, and that spur wheel can drive the stones to mill the flour. But the central shaft does other things as well. It rises up to the top floor, and here what you're actually looking at is a chain hoist lift. It's really a very clever arrangement. And on the garner floor, what you've got is an arrangement by which you can control that hoist from the ground level where the wheat is brought in. Let me explain to you, if I can, how it works, and then we'll show you it working. There is a rope, and that rope passes down from the garner floor through the stone floor to the ground floor of the mill, and it can be operated where the wheat is brought in. When you pull it, it operates a beam that tightens a belt, and that belt will drive this pulley system around which a chain wraps itself, lifting the wheat up through the floors, up onto the garner floor where you need it.
And here we are doing just that. There's a ring on a chain that allows you to form a loop on the ground floor. You put that loop round the sack, tighten it right up, and then pull on that rope that passes between all 3 floors. And you can see the chain start to rise, and the sack will go up and it'll pass through a trapdoor to the stone floor and another trapdoor to the garner floor. Here's the first, and these trapdoors are weighted, so as you can see, the sack pulls through and then the trapdoor drops back again, and that's safety so that you don't have a big hole in the floor for you to fall through. And here's the sack going up onto the garner floor, the top floor of the building. You can see the pulley going around, the chain rising up, wrapping itself around that spindle. And on the left, in front of that window arrangement, is the rope. So there's the sack going through. Look at the rope. You can see me letting it go. And you listen for the smack as the trapdoor closes, because you don't want that sack caught around the spindle. Once you've got it up there, what you have to do is disconnect it from the chain. And usually you'd have 2 people doing this if you had a lot of sacks to raise. Once you disconnect it from the chain, you can put the chain down, and because the belt is now slack, you can unspool the chain from the spindle and drop it back down to the ground floor. There's a bit of a trick to it, because you've got to thread that chain through the gap in the 2 trap doors, so it's a little bit like sort of threading a needle. You have to be careful to get it in the right place, or it'll just spool up on the floor below. Now that you've got your sack, you can take it over to one of the grain hoppers, and every set of stones has its own grain hopper. It's a big wooden box with a lid on to stop dust and muck getting into the wheat. You take your sack of wheat, you pour it into the grain hopper, and it can then go down through a square wooden chute and feed the set of millstones on the floor below, and it's controlled by a little gate.
The second part of the process is to use gravity to feed that wheat down into the millstones and grind it for flour. There's a lot of intricacies to that, from different types of stones for different types of flour, through to how to connect and disconnect them. Let's take a look at how it works.
Let's take a quick look at the mechanism in diagram, and then we'll do it for real. I didn't realise there are multiple types of stones for different kinds of flour. So this mill's using Derbyshire gritstone for wholemeal flour and French burstone for white flour. And the French burstone removes the bran from the outside of the wheat before grinding, whereas the gritstone grinds it all together. Now, to connect different sets of stones, we have the spur wheel, the big 10-foot wheel at the top. And what we have to do is connect different sets of stones to that according to what we need. And this mill has had up to 5 sets of stones running in different places and in different ways. They're currently just operating the 2, but how they work is really very interesting. So this is the stone floor, and that is the spur wheel, the big 10-foot wheel that sits in the middle of the stone floor. And you can see the stones. On the left is the Derbyshire gritstone, and on the right is the French burstone, which is actually brought in pieces and then banded and held together with plaster of Paris, apparently. It's an amazing thing. I didn't think that would work. Now, how do you connect them? Well, there's a big post that goes through the middle of the stone called the quant post, and that can be swung in and out of position so that it either does or does not connect with the spur wheel. Obviously the spur wheel has to be stopped while you do that. And at the top of the quant post is a nut called the stone nut, and this is one of those, and fascinatingly they're made of wood, so that if the mechanism jams for any reason, you don't shear apart the stones or the metal or the complicated expensive stuff. The nut itself will break, actually acting as a safety feature. The wheat comes down into the centre of the stones and then is milled outwards to produce the flour. And you can see at the top of the diagram there is a square tube, and that comes down from the hopper that we filled earlier on the floor above. And in effect that wooden bin all focuses the wheat down into that hopper, and its flow is controlled. What's really interesting is that all the controls are down on the ground floor. There's a set of gear called the tentering gear, and the tentering gear controls how close the stones are to one another and therefore how finely they grind. And there is also a crook string, and the crook string adjusts the speed at which that wheat comes down from the hopper on the floor above into the stone floor and into the grinding wheels. Let's connect some of those together and have a go. In order to connect a set of stones, it's actually really easy. Open a gate on the bearing, and then this big vertical shaft that drives the stones is known as the quant post. Rock it into the bearing. It's mechanical. Obviously, we've stopped the water wheel. Turn the stone nut a little bit to get the teeth to bind, and then just close up the bearing above. And that set of stones is now connected to the spur wheel. Before we restart the water wheel, we'll put a sack on the flower chute in order to catch the flower, and we'll let down some wheat into the hopper that's immediately above the stones. There's a big hopper up on the garner floor, and then there's a smaller hopper that directly feeds into the middle of the stones, and we want that to be full. Now if it isn't, the stones rub on each other, so there's a really clever device that's been fitted, and it's this leather strap, because you're going to operate the stones from the ground floor. You can't see what's going on in this hopper while you're milling. So what you do is you bury that strap, and look at that lever on the right pulling tight. You bury it in the wheat, and the weight of the wheat holds the lever. When it lets go, it rings a bell on the ground floor. All that in place, let's open the sluice gate. It really isn't very hard, but it's amazing. That slow creaking, groaning sound is nothing like modern kind of electrical driven machinery. With the sluice open, the spur wheel starts to turn. With the spur wheel turning, what we can see is the quant post turning as the stone nut binds on the spur wheel, and the stones themselves start to rotate, and now we're milling. Now that we've started, you can see the stones spinning freely and a few wheat berries falling in, but the stones are apart to overcome inertia, so they're not milling properly. To adjust that, we adjust the tentering screw down on the ground floor to bring them together. Then you can see here's the wheat dropping down past that string that controls the bell, down into the stones, and it will be being milled for white flour. Down on the ground floor, we can actually watch that flour come down the flower chute, but we have to be careful it's being milled correctly, so a handful of the flour can be checked to see if it's of the right level of fineness. After you've been milling for a while, you're going to run out of wheat in the hopper above the stones, and that little bell begins to ring. And bear in mind, the miller is likely to be down on the ground floor controlling the milling operation, and that bell warns him that what he's got to do is get up onto the stone floor, let some wheat down from the garner floor into the hopper above the stones. It's controlled by a slide, and again you can see that string where you can reset the bell. At the end of milling, we stop the water wheel and clean down the flower chute. There's always some flour trapped in the chute, and you can see it falling out here, and you don't want that getting infected with flour weevils and other forms of livestock. We also need to disconnect the stone, so it's the same process in reverse. Open the bearing, and then we can move the stone nut, disconnecting the teeth, and then rock the quant post out of the bearing. There is a little loop on the bearing gate that you can put over the quant post just to hold it securely until you want to reconnect those stones.
The third part of our process happens on the floor below, and that's where for white flour we separate out the bran from the flour and bag it up. So let's take a look at how that works.
The machine that's used to separate the white flour from the bran is called a bolter, and this is a small electrical one that the mill uses for demonstration purposes. An original one would have been driven by the water wheel, would have been more than 10 foot long, and a fantastic thing, but probably not so easy to understand. Let's take a look inside. You can see a column that's going from the centre of the screen to the top left, and that's a tube of fine mesh, and inside that tube are rotating brushes that go round and round, and the flour passes through the tube, and the flour is fine enough to pass through the mesh, but the bran is too large and passes out the end of the column. So what you have to do is load the mixed flour and bran into one end, to the top end of the tube, and then it passes down, and if you look, there's a chute on the right where the white flour that's fine enough to pass through the mesh comes out of the bolter, and on the left the bran, which is larger particles, goes all the way through the tube and passes out of the end. And that's why it really matters to mill to the right fineness that we showed earlier, because you can't have that bran so fine that it passes through the mesh, but the white has to be fine enough. After we've bolted the flour, it has to be weighed out into bags or sacks. And here's Fiona weighing it out, and you can visit the mill free of charge when it's open. You can buy their flour that's milled so sustainably, and it's a great place to go. Before we move on, I must take a moment and thank Celia, Malcolm, Dawn and Anne, who set up this day for us, allowed us to record, were endlessly patient, and even baked us scones from the flour that was milled. It was a fantastic day. You can visit the mill free of charge on the 4 days a week that they're open, and even see live milling on the second Sunday of every month, all without paying.
We have had a fabulous time operating this watermill. It's fantastic fun. And you know what? You can do it too. If it's the sort of thing that would interest you, we'll put a link down in the description, and you can come along, and for a very small fee you can get to operate a watermill. I mean, how fantastic is that? Now, I know this video has been a bit of a departure for us, something different, but if you've enjoyed it, can you let us know in the comments, and we will happily make more on local history, local interest, old agricultural techniques and all that kind of thing. If you'd like to see those videos and everything else we make, just tap on subscribe down there, hit the bell next to it, you'll hear every time we upload a new video. But for today, thanks for watching. Come back and see us soon. Take care.